on the employee side. You said, what if you've got kids who are young and they're growing up and you'd like to spend more time with them? Do you have to say the same thing that your father and grandfather said, which was, I have to go and spend my 40 hours or more at work to pay the bills, to bring home the bacon, and I can't get away? Well, it's not as true now as it was 50 years ago. And even though it's psychologically hard for people to come to grips with that, if you say, look, are you going to let your kids grow up and never see them except when you come home at night from work? Are you going to miss all their athletic and dance and performing arts activities or whatever else it might be, their debates? This is a choice, and you can make this choice.
I welcome everybody. I am really excited to have you here, this guest today. This is somebody who knows so much about what's going on in the 4-day work week, the trends from a global standpoint, from a bigger picture standpoint. Sometimes as solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, we get focused on the smaller view, and he's got a really great perspective on the bigger view. He is the professor and director for Latin America for the Thunderbird School of Global Management, author of the book, The 4-Day Workweek. Please join me in greeting Professor Robert Grosse. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Wade. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So I got to listen to your audiobook on the 4-Day Workweek, and as somebody who's been doing this for a while, it felt so, number one, comforting to hear certain things, and also there was so much I learned of reasons why certain things that I had thought of theories either worked or didn't work. So I would try something and say, oh, that seemed like it would work and it didn't work, or it did work. And a lot of the information behind it was right in your book that I was like, oh gosh, if I had read that or known that, I would have seen that. So what I'd first ask, if you don't mind sharing, can you share just a brief history of the standard work week in the US and or even globally, and how that has been shifting and why that's becoming an issue today?
Okay, I think that I should probably comment that there is clearly a big difference between somebody in an entrepreneurial or small firm and the Fortune 500 size companies that tend to be the ones that I focus on, because you get, I guess, more bang for the buck when you say we can get, as Henry Ford did 100 years ago, you get one giant car company to adopt the 4-day work week, and all of a sudden you have 100,000 people who are doing it. So it's not that I prefer that. It's just that that's the sort of the impact that seems to me like it's going to potentially pervade the rest of the economy quicker than even if we get 500 entrepreneurs who are in companies with 10 employees each, But anyway, in response to your question, the work week in the United States, I guess happily, I'll give a big smile here, has gone down or has become less over the years. I mean, none of us can go back to the 1800s, but if you did, when most people in the United States were in the farming sector, believe it or not, the workday started when it got light and it ended when it got dark. And so that could be 12 hours or 14 hours a day or 6 or whatever it is, depending on how far north you are in the wintertime. But anyhow, it was not really a structured week, and it really took the Industrial Revolution, that's still going pretty far back there, when people started working in factories and offices to have a work week that was a little bit more structured. You'd hit a time clock or you'd punch a time clock, and it would be, start, I don't know, at the beginning of the morning at 8 o'clock and finish at whatever time it would be, 6 at night, and you have your 10-hour work week. And this is in the 1800s. So this was very common, even in the early 1800s, in the industrial side of the economy, in other words, not in farming. So if you think of that, you got a 10-hour workday, and people were working 6-day weeks. I mean, it was not, Saturday was not a holiday, Sunday was. So you had, what is that, 6 times 10, that's 60-hour weeks, man. It's hard to even imagine that. But that's the reality that people faced. And as the century went along, and really after the Civil War in the 1860s, after that, people in offices and factories, the unions started to become more important, and they pushed for better conditions for the workers, and better conditions would be safer conditions and maybe less onerous work, including fewer hours. So there was a push that really didn't succeed, although there were strikes and there were efforts in the 1800s to get a more favorable work week and more favorable treatment of the workers. It really took till the beginning of the 20th century till we got down to a 6-day, 8-hour-a-day work week. So it wasn't that the number of days was reduced, but companies and government agencies went down pretty much across the board by, I don't know, 1910 or so, right before World War I, to about a 6-day, 8-hour-a-day week. And then almost immediately, but after the war, there was again unions pressuring big employers to reduce the burden on their workers and, of course, raise wages and other aspects of the business of the work. And so Henry Ford just unilaterally in 1926 said, I'm going to give my workers a 5-day week. Still 8 hours a day, but 40-hour Monday through Friday work week. It's wow. Today we think, that's not very special. Yeah, but that was 100 years ago. It's really quite striking. And Ford was not a dummy. He was facing strikes, not every day, but I mean, there was worker unrest. And he had the idea that maybe if I reduce the work hours, people might be more motivated and more efficient at the work. Maybe they can produce the same number of Model A's and Model T's in 5 days that they were doing in 6 days if they're happier and if they work more efficiently. So, I mean, he didn't budget that out exactly, but that was sort of the spirit of it, along with reducing the kind of labor strife. And, by God, it actually worked. They did produce as many Fords in 1927 and 28 as they had in the years before that, despite working 1 day less per week and getting to the 40-hour week. So rather than prolong my story further, because we haven't reduced the work week in a legalistic sense, since actually the government made that the law in 1938. So it took 12 years after Ford initiated in the private sector this model, if you will, that the government made it policy for U.S. government workers, and it pretty much pervaded the whole economy. So since then, there hasn't been any legal change or any big company jumping in and saying, I want to have, I don't know, the next logical thing, I guess, would be a 4-day week. This is what Wade believes in. And, I actually do too, for various reasons, some of which are the same as his and some of which are different. But in any event, we're now looking at, if you look at the trajectory over time, we're looking at an average amount of hours, number of hours that people work in the United States today on the average of less than 38 hours per week, not 40. So it isn't a whole day less, but it is less than that kind of ironclad 5-8-hour days that we like to talk about. So I'll end my story there.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And so much of that I had learned, I'd heard in different areas, different pieces of it. And one of the things that you mentioned, I think that's so relevant is, first of all, there was a natural progression of this. And sometimes people get really concerned if they say, okay, wait, is the government going to force this, or are we going to say people can't work? Nobody that I talk to is saying, oh no, this is going to be an all or nothing, or it can't be. It's about saying what would be the default. And the way I try to look at it from is, if you have a person who is the traditional average worker, if you look at all the gains that have been made financially, just even if you look at the wealth around us, and you talk about years ago when the patent offices were saying, well, they were going to close the patent offices because there was going to be no more, patents, and all these ideas, or eventually people will, just work 5 hours a week because there'll be nothing to do. And of course, if we're going to live the same exact lifestyle as 100 plus years ago, that probably would be doable. But of course, we're humans and our needs evolve. But one of the things that I just look at is, well, what if it was the default? And to your point, once you start hitting 38 hours, I think of a lot of the people I work with, they'll say, well, Wade, my people work 8:30 to 5 with an hour for lunch. So technically it's a 37.5-hour work week. Well, you're getting so close. And I just approached it more anecdotally. And this is why I love talking with you and looking at your research, because I just knew, first of all, as somebody who's worked with employees, both as an employee and as somebody who supervised employees, number one, my 5th day of the week, so to speak, was never stellar. It was never awesome. Maybe halfway through a Friday, I'd kind of get a little, already thinking about what's going on the weekend or that sort of stuff. And there's also so much research around how many hours in a day a person puts in of really good solid work. And I've seen anything from 4 hours to 6 hours. I've never seen more than about 6 hours.
Yeah.
So you get back to that same conversation of, okay, well, if we're looking to create a result, and if we can measure, because obviously the business owner has to make it work, whether it's a large business or a small business. The math has to work. And I always remind people, look, I'm still, the math trumps everything, because if the math doesn't work, it's not sustainable. And then now we're actually creating a not so good situation. But overall, this almost expectation to say, okay, well, now we're going to shift a little. If we want this, even if it's Fridays off, so even if you said a half a day or a full day, well, then there needs to be a different approach to what work is, that you come in and you focus and you get stuff done, and you're not on social media and you're not, messing around. You're coming in, getting results. But because I've never met a person that would say to me, yes, Wade, I give 100% for 40 hours. I've never met a person that's been that bold to tell me that. Most people would say, yeah, Wade, I'm probably, how many hours a week are you productive? I don't know, 30, 25, 35. And if it's an entrepreneur, they're usually more honest, because they're not worried somebody's going to wait about 20, 25. Okay, well, let's look at that. And when you look at what's going on now, why is it that you'd say, though, that this is coming up? Because as you said, it's been almost 100 years since it was made the law. And yet, to your point, some sort of leader could make this push and it might get to widespread adoption. But why is it ripe now? Why is it feel so close?
Oh boy, I don't know. I mean, you could easily say the same thing in, I don't know, 1960 or 1990, what's so special about now? I mean, there's one issue which we'll come to at some point, I'm sure, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And I mean, that's real. And people have lost their jobs or temporarily think they're on temporary, whatever you call it, not working, but expecting to come back. And they're not all going to come back, for sure. And of course, people are working from home. So that's a different kind of adjustment. It's not necessarily fewer hours, but if you're not commuting, then that takes some of the burden of the workday away from you. And even that, is beneficial in the sense of number of hours. But what is special about today, other than COVID-19, I'd say nothing really. However, you've got people working in the gig economy, defined as you work either at your choice, but you have of number of hours and timing of hours, or at least it's much more subject to reconfiguration according to the individual. The work week is more subject to your choice of which hours, and typically how many hours as well. So if you work for Uber, or if you work for any company that allows you to choose your own work time and even workplace in many instances, but Uber is a nice example since it's so clear to everybody. The average person does not work 40 hours in that company. But then you say, yeah, but that's because they'd like to, but there isn't enough business available for them to do it, or whatever else might be the challenge. But nevertheless, the reality is the number of hours that we are working, meaning people in America, is going down. And that's interesting, Wade, because women are working more than they did 20 or 30 years ago. Think, 50 years ago, before people who are listening to this were in the workforce, our mothers and grandmothers typically worked in the home. So they didn't have remunerated earnings or remunerated jobs in the workplace, other than maybe secretarial in the bad old days. But women over these past years and 20, 30, 40, 50 years have been working more hours in the compensated workplace outside of the home. So how can this be? They're working more, yet our average number of hours worked during the week of employees, not just males, is going down. And the point really is, I guess, the women are kind of going up, but they're not getting up to 40 hours per week on average. And the guys are going down from 40 or whatever it is to start with to a lower number. And the average is somewhere between 35 and 40, but getting closer every year to 35. So this is where we are de facto. Now, if you say, okay, I work for whatever it is, Citibank or McDonald's or I don't know, some mining company or some factory, Ford Motor, you got a 40-hour time clock based week, and by God, that's what you're working. Now, you may, as you said a minute ago, be working with a 30-hour lunch break or an hour lunch break in the 8 hours. So it's really only less than that you're working, but you're at work the whole time. Okay, but you've got those people who are in the structured week, and then you've got many people who have less structure to their week. And I'm thinking professors and high school teachers and lawyers, and doctors and many people who are, I don't know what you call them, professional services types, including Wade Galt, who are running a service business themselves at the time that they choose to work. So now maybe somebody, not you evidently, wants to work 60 or 70 hours a week, not because you like it necessarily, but because you've got to pay the bills. And you mentioned something about the financial issue that we'll come back to later on. But even as an entrepreneur, it's kind of hard to get your hours down if you have to make payroll or if you have to pay the bills. So I don't know. The reality is the number of hours worked is going down for sure. It's not going down like in a big chunk of reduced time this year or last year, except COVID-19's impact. Yet this is a good time to talk about it because more and more people, let's call it, have the opportunity to take your point of view of why not work fewer hours, why not work one day less and have a more enjoyable life. I mean, I do subscribe to that, but my view different from yours is I'm trying to bring along the people who don't have that choice and say, you may believe it or not believe it, but it's good for you to do that. And let's see if we can convince companies to come along.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that I've been looking at is it seems to me that getting people to change if they don't want to is difficult. And yet, to your point, if there's leadership, if people can see things, then it's perhaps more doable. And I actually am approaching it from a few different angles. Educationally, I'm trying to help people who are employees understand, look, this is a math equation. And the same thing goes for entrepreneurs or anybody. First, you have to, at least in my experience, first you have to be able to say, I can afford to work 4 days. If you can't do that, to your point, then no law is going to help you because then you got to go get a second job. So
Right.
Part of this just goes back to whether you want to call it budgeting, materialism, minimalism, all those different forces of can you simply live on what you make? And there's not necessarily judgment there. Sometimes you simply have a lot of extra expenses or whatever it might be. You look at all the decisions of how many kids people choose to have, where they choose to live, the car they choose to drive. Then you go into things such as everything from healthcare to eating habits that perhaps lead to greater healthcare expenses, to sleeping habits that perhaps lead to need for psychological services that might not be needed. In other words, for depression, there's all these mixed things that there's so many opinions and so many other things going on. But to me, I like to come back to simple things when I can and say math. If you can afford to, then at least it's a possibility, because right now, to your point with COVID, there are so many employers that are saying, look, we get that employee turnover is a beast. We don't know when we're going to go back to normal production levels, but we know we can't now. We don't want to lose our team that we've spent all these years building and all this money building. But hey, everybody, right now, and I'll just make it over simple. Let's say we can only work at 80% capacity. We want to keep everybody. We're literally, for two reasons. One, because we believe in people, but also just because, again, math, even if we're selfish, we want to keep things as stable as possible. And yet there almost needs to be some sort of understanding of, okay, but math is a greater force, at least, or truth is, or the market, than personal preference, and some sort of deference to, okay, well, I'm going to have to adjust here. And that's what I try to tell people. If you're an employee, first approach it from talking to your employer about what results would you need? And if I got those results, what would those results be that it would be at least worth it for you to consider other benefits? Some people might want bonuses in cash. Some people might want paid vacation. There can be different ways. What are the concerns you find that are most common among employers? Because you mentioned somebody leading the charge. And of course, to your point, having somebody we've seen people, Microsoft, other large companies do experiments and then either take some of it or pull back, or maybe this one unit gets to, and maybe it doesn't apply to everybody. What are some of the common concerns employers have that you find?
Well, I mean, concern number one for a big company, I'm sure this is true for a small company as well, but speaking away from your entrepreneurs in that context of the Fortune 500, where they've got 2,000 or 3,000 people working at the company, if you're the employer, you can't take 20% of the work week away, in other words, one day, and expect to produce the same number of widgets, or like in a restaurant or a hotel or a bank, serve the same number of clients the way you did before. I mean, no matter how efficient people are in a hotel, they can't do it. They can't do the same. They can't serve the 20% more people and keep things going at the same rate as before. So, excuse me, a company, if you say you're going to have people work 80% of their normal week, this is your math. If they're going to work 4 days instead of 5, somebody's got to work the 5th day to fill in. So you've got to have, another, turns out numerically to be 25% additional workers to fill in that time, because they're also going to only work 4 days a week. So instead of 20% more people, you need 25% more. I don't want to get carried away with numbers. The point is you're going to need more employees, and that's going to be expensive. So if you pay the same people the same and they only work 4 days instead of 5, you're going to have to hire some number of additional people. Even if the others in the bank or the hotel or the restaurant or whatever it is do get a little bit more efficient, they can't imaginably be so much more efficient in dealing with the people who come to the restaurant or the hotel, et cetera, that they're going to make up the difference in terms of productivity. So the bank is going to be out of luck. They're going to have a loss. They're going to have less income than they would otherwise, and the shareholders will be unhappy. And so now what do? Okay, this is a real challenge. Okay, so you said the other side of the coin might be, well, if I'm a worker and I'm willing to take a 20% pay cut, then, more power to me. That's great. And that will accomplish what Wade wants to get to. I'm going to blame you rather than me. So, that's what you want to achieve. Okay, well, it's okay, but think of the whatever percent of total employees in the United States it may be. I don't really know, but say 20% of people are earning between $20,000 and $40,000 a year. They can't afford it. They can't pay the rent and the food and the clothing to live on 80% of their previous salary or wage. So, man, there's people who are really stuck. And as much as they'd like to do this, if the company says we're going to have a 4-day work week and you're going to take a 20% pay cut, I think you mentioned this earlier, but the logical answer is anybody who wants to continue working 5 days may do that and have their same salary. So as long as you have that out, as long as that's a rule that says the normal week is 4 days, you may work 5 if you need the income. Or I don't know if it's possible, it depends on the way it's structured. But if it is a hotel or a restaurant or something, you could work more hours in a day. You could work 10-hour days instead of 8. So in principle, you could structure it so that you get your 40 hours in various ways. But if you're at the lower end of the income scale, and you haven't been talking about those people, and they probably aren't most of your entrepreneurs, but hey, this is a few million people in the United States, so let's not ignore them. And I think it's going to be a challenge, but the good news is they could still work the 40 hours a week, whether it's in 5 days or 4 10-hour days or whatever other structure it might be. They could do that. They can do that. The structure can permit it, especially in these services businesses that I keep mentioning. So let me leave that aside for a second. If you talk about making cars, I think if you've got an assembly line, if you've got a factory, it definitely is conceivable that if you work fewer days, you could be more productive. And you could actually, magically raise your productivity by 20% and not produce any fewer cars Monday through Thursday than you did Monday through Friday. And this is not talking about people slacking off and being jerks or whatever, negative thing you could say. It's simply more motivation, more productivity in the 4 days because you have that extra relief over the long weekend. So, I could see that working in some businesses. And I don't mean to make that less of our story either. But I think the real challenge when you talked about numbers is 2 things. One is the company employers who are going to have less widgets that they produce or less amount of service they provide the customers. And they got to hire more people to cover that. That's real. And the second is the people who can't afford any reduction in salary or wages. They need to work their 40 hours, or maybe they're working 45 or more hours. I bet I know many Uber drivers are working Uber and they're also working part-time somewhere else. And you add up their hours per week and it could be 50 or 60. So there's not a 40-hour limit, and people at the low end of the scale for sure are likely to be looking for more hours, not fewer. Okay, I guess that's enough for this.
Oh no, that's great, and because there's so much to it. There's a few things, and so to your point, yeah, I'm all about just expanding people the possibility, the choice of, hey, this is something that could be done the same way. It's possible to earn 100,000 a year or 500,000 a year. You might not want to work that hard. There might be all these reasons or variables. A lot of what I find is for the employer, the company, the main issue is turnover costs and productivity. So to your point, in my experience with smaller businesses, you can find 5% of inefficiency, maybe even 10%. Like if you really look at the numbers and get out all the books and this contract here, or these ads, you can find a 5 to 10, even as much as 10%. 10 might be high in larger companies. In smaller companies, it's easier. So you can make up 5% to your point of that difference, and you can do, and over time you could possibly become much more productive.
For sure.
But to your point, to do it in a short run is very difficult, and this is why for me, the one-sided solution is unrealistic, and why I loved what you explored so much in your work of the somewhere meeting in the middle, the somewhere, some sort of us getting there, and whoever us is. Because again, some people say, wait, I'm not interested. I want to work my 60 hours. I'm happy. I'm doing work I love. So again, for me, it's not about a one size fits all, but it is something that, and this is where to some people this is woo-woo, but to me, it's very simple when people say, well, if you work less hours, you can get less productivity. Well, if you change the conversation to athletics and you say, okay, I'm the coach of a football or basketball team and the championship game is coming up in a week. Do I do 2-a-day practices the week before? Yeah. No, I rest my team so they can perform. Now that's an extreme because the big game is worth so much more than the other games in the season. But somewhere in there is a concept, again, of optimum rest and sleep and whatnot. Sure. And when you look at even athletes in the NBA that are now focusing more on their rest and their sleep, where 15 years ago, that was, you're soft. Well, you need more sleep. And now they realize, no, we're still humans. And so I think there's areas there, but overall, math is always at the center, just smiling, just saying 1 and 1 is still 2, no matter what we decide. And to your point, a lot of this is, what could it look like? And I look for the inefficiencies too, as far as motivation. So if someone comes to me as an individual and is in that lower income group you're talking about, my conversation with them is something around, okay, like anything else, if you were saving for a house, might you go to happy hour less because you have this vision that's important to you? And again, I'm not looking to give you your vision, if that's your vision. And different things such as that. Might you eat better if you thought it could reduce your healthcare costs? So there's different things, and there's a lot of, but again, there's so many different loose ends and pieces, but ultimately I see it as something that can be simple, that the same way that years ago I made $5 an hour and I now make more than $5 an hour, at some point I worked 40 hours or 50 hours a week. Could I perhaps work less? But again, it requires, in my understanding, a more mature employee, in addition to a more mature employer, to be able to say, I see what your concern is. You want results, so let's talk results. And then to your point, definitely you have your service group, and I'm using that as a generic term, the live service tech support that needs to be there a certain number of hours because that's what's been promised to the client, versus the person that says, I produce widgets, I cut hair, I cut lawns, I do something that if I'm quicker and more focused, that I can perhaps get a better result. And those are slightly different. And yeah, that is the part that I don't think will ever change. And I don't think it's bad. Some people do want to make more money and focus, and some people are less concerned with that. But definitely, I think the idea of waiting for government to fix it, and this is not in any way a knock on government, I don't even think is necessarily wise, much less on either side, than to say, okay, yes, at times, when union involvement happens more, maybe it's needed. But if people can figure things out without union involvement, that's probably more effective. The same way when you don't have to get an attorney involved in a divorce case, it's probably more effective if the market can figure out without having to have this sense of confrontation, of argument or consternation. What do you find are the concerns for the workers, and are they similar to the employees, or how are they parallel, or how are they different?
Okay, you're talking about employees versus
employees,
employers.
Yes, and/or gig workers for that matter, because that's a growing segment now,
as contrasted with the companies. Okay, so I think the main issue that I run into when I talk, and you must see this too, when I talk with people about working 4 days instead of 5, they're saying, oh, you're an academic, your head's up in the clouds. Nobody does that. And it's the classic human nature issue. This is the way it's always been. You know, my father worked 40 hours a week. That's why I do it. Well, that's like saying, you know, my father worked in a coal mine in West Virginia and I do it too. And then the coal mine closes. Well, you know, by God, it's the government's fault that the coal mine closed. Give me a break. I mean, the world changes and you have to be somewhat flexible and say, I might do things differently. But it is very difficult to get people to accept that. So somebody, again, has to make the break. And if you're, and start off with a 40-hour week, switching to a 32-hour week. Well, in other words, 4-day week instead of 5-day week. And, you know, it can be an employer that's an individual. You know, if you're a gig worker and you can say, okay, I want to only work 4 days instead of 5. Well, you know, good luck, because you're going to have less income. So that's not such a smart thing unless you can charge a high enough fee for your service that you can live on it. And that typically the gig workers are not high income people. Although I guess you could call doctors and lawyers gig workers unless they're in big firms. If they're individual, you know, sole practitioners, then they work at their leisure, at their pleasure. And if they want to work 4 days, you know, they can do that. Most of them don't, though. Most of them still do put in a 5-day week, even though, as you and I have been saying all along, it's quite feasible to work 4 days and 8-hour days, not, you know, 20-hour days or some outrageous thing to squish more work hours into those 4 days. Anyway, what do people think? I think it's I mean, what do the employee people think? This is the way it's always been, therefore this is the way it is. You know, God must have told us that this is how the world works. And we know that people used to work longer hours. We may not have been around in 1926 when Henry Ford made the change, or in the 1800s, you know, but you know that this was the reality then, or read a book, you know, look at it on the internet and find out this was the reality. So don't tell me we've always worked 40 hours a week or 5-day weeks. It is not true. Now, how can we get it down to 4 days? The person the individual that you asked me about a moment ago has got to figure a way to survive on either less money or convincing the company to pay him the same for working 4 days instead of 5, thinking as an employee of a company. So if you can demonstrate in your business that it is possible to have a 20% increase in your productivity, meaning how much you produce per hour. So in 40 hours, you produce, you know, 100, and if you work 32 hours, if you can still produce 100, whatever the product is, then why should the employer care? And presumably the employer would not, had you fine. The problem is if you produced 100 with 40 hours and you only produce 90 with 32 hours, is the company going to eat that 10% less output? Or are you going to take a 10% salary reduction or wage reduction? That's very tricky, and we will continue to come back to it. Somehow you have to figure out how to pay for that. That's the numbers that you've been talking about. And as a person who's receiving the income, you have to make kind of a decision. And I've looked at some of your posts on the internet, on your website, and you cajole people to think about their lives and what they're doing with their time. So if they are flexible enough, meaning they have enough income to be flexible, then of course they can potentially reduce hours and income and have a potentially more enjoyable life, a more satisfying life. But you know, you got to be in a position where that is a choice. And there's this huge societal pressure that says, even if you could make the choice, society is going to view you as a slacker unless you keep going for the 5 days. And that's tricky. I mean, it's possible to overcome that, but there's the two barriers. One's your income and the other is society's pressure.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people see this as something that is outside of them. And now if you go back to sort of some of more basic, either, what do you want to call it? Psychology, personal development, life coaching, whatever. Some of this addresses something that I don't think will be necessarily changed. And, you know, for those of y'all listening, I have a master's degree in psychology. I believe people can change. I believe many people don't choose to. So I believe the possibility and reality are not always the same thing. And you look at, you know, that concept of locus of control. who has control? Is control out there, which a lot of people believe that control is out there. And there is certainly forces out there, that's for sure. And then there's control in here, head, brain, soul, whatever you subscribe to. And somewhere in there, to your point, what I look to do is say, okay, what is there? Is there something that's more inspiring to you? And to some people are very past based, and they believe the best of what's happened years ago, either in their life, they'll talk about high school all day long and whatever, and that's okay. But so to them, it feels scarier to do something new. But to your point, this same conversation went on 100 plus years ago, and people said, oh my God, we could never work 5 days a week. We always worked 6. The same thing happened.
Yeah.
And we're so demanding of our technology, like, darn it, I want 10G on my phone yesterday. So I want change, but I don't want, so it's kind of interesting the way our brain works. I still love the song, the God is great, beer is good, and people are crazy, because I think that answers a lot of questions. But so for me, it has to be something that's inspiring to you enough, because it's going to be change. There will be a fear and a possibility of loss. I don't discount the facts that I was raised in a family where income was steady. Dad provided really well. Mom was able to stay at home because of what dad provided. So I do my best to say, okay, Wade, you don't have the view of what everybody else has. Some people have different views. Some people have more financially or less or whatnot. So I try to bring it back to, again, things that, well, we used to be able to agree on math, but things such as math, to say, okay, well, this is a puzzle. This is, or can be. I definitely find that with the clients I work with that are even entrepreneurs, there's a sweet spot of those who really want to make this happen. Usually it's the parents of young children, let's say anywhere from 0 to at least 10, even 15, where in their mind they understand, or they believe, understand would assume it's true, but they believe that, okay, I'm missing out on something. My kids are here. They're only going to be here for a while.
Yeah.
Because I've always told people, look, I've watched in my father's business, his friends, I've watched a few that they made so much money when their kids were about 15 and 16, and they were working so hard, and like, I'm ready to play. And it's just like the cats in the cradle, and the kids were gone. And it's like, okay, yeah, they're already out of the house. So there's that, but some people don't subscribe to that. Now for me, that's where I say, well, that's choice. That's life. That is, I do believe in, yes, you choose. I do not want a government mandating it, but I do like the idea and I'd spoken with somebody about this that gave me some of the variables and said, okay, but if we can measure more deeply, perhaps we can see where when a person is, and on a large, okay, so let's use the government as an example, because they can decide their hours to a certain degree. And assuming they get on the same page on something, which they do sometimes they don't. If you could demonstrate, well, hey, because of the lesser hours, here's how many less absences we've had. Here's how much less it's cost us in health insurance. And so there are variables. It's kind of like the radio waves or the Wi-Fi waves passing by us. They're there, but we don't see them. And I think part of this is the challenge. And I try to do it from an anecdotal standpoint, is to say, was it worth more for you to be able to go to the beach or play golf than to spend a 5th day at your office? Or as I like to joke with entrepreneurs, if you make horrible cakes 4 days a week, are you going to turn into a magic chef on Fridays? No, take your 4 days worth of cakes and take your money. And, but definitely there can be a lot of seriousness around this. And I think that's one of the toughest things is when it becomes very serious. It doesn't have to be very serious. Some people make more money. An NBA athlete makes more than I do, literally multiples in the 100 times plus. I'm okay with that. And some people aren't okay with that, but that's what the market says. The market says people will pay for that. So part of it, I think, is, for those who want to be able to reach up, and I'll suggest books over the internet. You mentioned the internet. I'll still go with books over the internet, usually because there's a lot of stuff on the internet. Most books, I'll go when a person's taking the time to write a book. I'll take the book over the internet, at least as far as possibly being a source of truth. But definitely, what do you find are the situations that are going to be more likely to succeed? And we kind of already addressed on some of these, as far as jobs, and then also implementing those. What's going to be more likely for the employer to be willing to take a risk versus what's a dangerous situation which is going to be less likely to succeed?
Okay, well, let me, give you 2 or 3 different parts of a response. Number one, on the employee side, you said, what if you've got kids who are young and they're growing up and you'd like to spend more time with them? Do you have to say the same thing that your father and grandfather said, which was, I have to go and spend my 40 hours or more at work to pay the bills, to bring home the bacon, and I can't get away? Well, it's not as true now as it was 50 years ago. And even though it's psychologically hard for people to come to grips with that, if you say, look, are you going to let your kids grow up and never see them except when you come home at night from work? Are you going to miss all their athletic and dance and performing arts activities or whatever else it might be, their debates? This is a choice, and you can make this choice. Now, it's easier for some people than others to say that, especially when you're working on a time clock. You may say, okay, fine, I will take fewer hours in order to go watch my kids in whatever the activity is. And so that is feasible in that context. If you're a high income person, you may feel like, gee, I want to compete with somebody else and have an even higher income. But like you said, you're never going to catch up to the NBA players. So at some point, I don't think everybody competes with the Joneses next door. I don't think everybody feels like I have to have just as good of a car or a house as they do. We say that a bit, but I don't run into too many people who actually subscribe to that view. So if you say I'm going to have a little less income and I'm going to go watch my kids do things or be there with them to support them, I think that's very viable for a lot of people, excepting the ones who are at the low end of the income scale where really that isn't possible. And I don't definitely want to forget them. Now, what kind of companies can do this more easily than others? Oh man, I guess the short answer would be any company where you could actually see people's productivity defined as amount of output per hour. If you could get that to go up in a way that's meaningful, like 10 or 20% per hour, then you can definitely have the company foot the bill and pay the people the same amount of money for 4 days as they get for 5 days, because they would presumably, in the Henry Ford case, be producing just as many cars in one less day per week. So whatever the business is where it's possible to ramp up productivity. Now be careful, because you said productivity in one way and I'm saying it, I think, in a different one. Productivity means, in the way I'm using it anyhow, the amount of output that you create in a period of time, like an hour or even a week. So if you produce, you work with a banker, you work with, 50 clients, and you provide them the service that they need in 5 days, can you still work with 50 clients in 4 days, the same 50 clients, say, in 4 days, and schedule them in tighter and spend a little bit less time with each one and get reasonably similar service provided to them? Can you do it? I mean, you certainly can't with the hamburgers at McDonald's, produce 20% more customers when you're already moving at sort of at full speed, and they're not all going to bunch their visit to McDonald's in to your particular 32 hours instead of the other 8 hours when you're not there. So there's a lot of difficulty in getting to where we want to go for the employers who can't push or pull more productivity, more output per hour from their people. And I'm not talking about slave labor here where you have a whip and you need to tell people do this or I'm going to kill you or fire you or hit you with a whip. It's just in some contexts you can do more. And you mentioned earlier on, I don't know if I responded to this, that everybody has some amount of the day where you're not really very productive, say 5%, or you said maybe even as much as 10%. Okay, absolutely true. But if you work 32 hours, if you work 4 days a week, you're still going to have the same problem. It may not be the same. It may be 4.5% instead of 5, or 8 instead of 10, whatever. But there's still going to be some part of the day when you're not that productive. That's the human body. If you work 4 days, you should have more, what do you call it, like vitality or capability to be more motivated, more productive during those 32 hours. There's got to be something to that. And even though we're not all in manufacturing jobs any longer, less than 10% of Americans are in manufacturing jobs these days. Almost 90% are in services. So, I mean, that's where the action is. If you're not in a business where it's easily reconformed to get more productive, this is going to be a problem. And, the company could certainly take some loss. And I don't want to get into numbers, just, there's going to be somewhat less output, somewhat fewer clients that you can serve in 4 days than 5, let's say. So you can eke a little bit more out in the 4 days. The company can take a little bit of a loss, but at the end of the day, expenses are going to be higher for the companies for some period of time until your productivity over the years gets better because of learning, because of more machinery, et cetera. So I think that's going to be the challenge, the way you've posed it. But okay, so that's the end of my answer on that. New answer. What about COVID-19? Okay, there are, oh God, I don't know what the number is today, but let's say 7% of Americans are unemployed right now. Before COVID-19, it was 3.5%. And that's a lot more people. That's twice as many people who are unemployed. And it was over 10% at the beginning of this problem back in March and April. So, I mean, this is real. How can you help those people who have lost jobs? One way is to tell everybody else, or many other people, you can only work 80% of your normal hours. And we're going to share those other 20% of the hours with these people who got laid off. You know, that is a real partial solution to the downturn in employment. Now, it may be temporary. I mean, hopefully it is. If we've got the 2 vaccines from Moderna and Johnson and probably some others too, that are going to, or Pfizer, I meant, that are going to be available soon, then that may get rid of the problem in the hotels and the restaurants and the other personal service businesses, so that they can ramp up again, and you know, the job loss will diminish, if not go away completely. So maybe it's only temporary, but if we get started by sharing the work like this, you know, Wade, you were commenting about psychology a minute ago. If people get used to working the 80% of their time, even though their income's lower, a lot of them are going to say, hey, this isn't bad. You know, this is actually something I should have done myself earlier when I wasn't pressed into this kind of service. So, you know, there is a real opportunity here due to the very severe challenge of this COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, and I just think of when I was younger. Now, this was before I had kids, and I hold that I want to be able to provide for my wife to be able to stay at home. When I was making 40,000 and then eventually making 50,000 as a single guy, I could have just, in fact, I asked, can I go back to the company I worked for? Can I just work 4 days and take, and great company at that time. It was, well, if you do it, everybody else is going to want to do it. And you know, that wasn't really what was set up at the time. And one of the things that, you know, I try to remind people, say, look, after leaving college, it took me 22 years to figure out how to do this. So I definitely don't think this is an entitlement. I don't think it's a right. I think it's something you earn. I think it's something that in some way you figure out. And that's not in any way diminishing those that are at lower income levels. Hopefully you evolve in your income, and you grow in what you're doing. And when I talk to small business owners, I've had quite a few small business owners ask me, because one of the businesses I have a software business, and the software helps compensate employees. And the primary focus of reward is financial. If you do more in sales and more in retaining clients, so some of it's service oriented, you can make more money. And I do have clients that then they will also offer paid time off incentives, but I always tell them, say, look, I don't necessarily believe in guaranteeing a 4-day work week at the same previous levels of income, at 100% of income. I say, keep the hourly income the same. And what my suggestion is, you tell people, look, if they hit certain productivity targets, then they earn that. So it's a possibility, and it's in the conversation. And I will coach you. I'll get the best help, because to speak, at least again, this is my experience. Some employees really take to training and developing and want to learn, and some just kind of look at you and like, well, I don't care that you spent that money. And so there is a part of it that's very much like anything else in our economy. Some people want to, some people don't. And so for me, a lot of what I look at with an employer, when I talk to them, is say, look, the main reason why any employer will ever even listen to me of a larger corporation is employee turnover costs. So if you can keep people happier and they stay with you longer, and you look at what employee turnover costs can be, because if you hire a bad employee, and I know you know this, but you know, just any person out there, if you hire an employee that doesn't work out and it takes you 3 months or 6 months to train them and it didn't work out, well, you just wasted at least 3 to 6 months worth of income, plus another 25 to 50% or more, because somebody else had to train them. There's other expenses. So it gets very costly. So that alone is not the only answer, but it's another one of those contributing forces that might take another 2 to 3 to 4% of that 20, that magical 20 we're talking about, of could we reduce that? And but it's a long game solution. It's not an immediate, you don't see that right away. You see it over time. But I know from just working in business in general, Some business owners are really good to people, and so those people stay longer, and so there's
Yeah.
less turnover. And then if you're talking to executives, then you say, and there's less pain in the butt of you having to train the same people on the same concept. Like, God, wait, I want to poke my eyes out. And this is even more small business owners where they're doing some of the training, say, for that, I'll do that. And so, you know, a lot of it is like anything else. What is it that motivates somebody to be open to changing? And it's not magic. And that's one of the things I loved best about your book. There was nothing magical in your book that was like, okay, here's this magical, here's the 4-day work week fairy is going to come in and everything's going to work out. It's not that. But like anything else, when we talk about, well, we put people on the moon, we can do what we do with technology, all these different things. Well, again, if it's important enough, you know, could it be something that people look at? The thing I look to, and I point to other friends, and sometimes friends like this or don't, is I have friends that live in Norway, and they work less hours and their income per capita is higher. They have a more homogenous society. They're 5 million people as opposed to 300 and something million people. So you have all these, but I still say, wait, but we could still learn something from them, right? We don't have to just dismiss anything and say, well, if, you know, we can learn nothing from them. And so I think part of this is looking at, you know, how we can make shifts. What do you see as far as, because there's, as somebody whose parents are from the islands, I've grown up, I've lived in Peru. I was born outside the country. I love America. And I find at times, like any person, we're so willing to hear what we do awesome, but sometimes we're a little blind to hearing what maybe we could do better. How is the US different with other countries? And maybe what are we doing great? And maybe what could we be learning from other countries that might help us move a little quicker?
Before I respond to that, let me just comment that I really liked your statement that says an employer should take into account the cost of replacing people when they leave, whether they're unhappy or whatever the reason is. But if they leave frequently, then you've got a hiring process that you have to pay for and a training process that you have to go through. And the new people aren't going to be identically productive until they go through a learning curve in addition to being trained. So there's real costs there that can be measured. And that would make it more attractive to a company to say, hey, we'll let you do this 4-day week because we recognize that maybe you'll only be a little bit more productive. But if you stay with us, then we won't have to pay those other costs that we will if you leave. And the more companies, of course, that offer this, the better. I mean, the more it'll be acceptable. So that was one point. And the second one, before I go international, is that with the COVID-19 challenge, the other thing that's going on is people are working from home. And this is, you know, whatever, 90% of people are doing that. Not just that people are getting laid off, but everybody or most everybody is working from home or from not the office anyway. And this is a big change. And if you do that and you say, I want to work, I was thinking if you're talking about, you see the other people and they're working in the job that you had before. And if they know you're not there 1 day a week, they're going to say Wade's a bad guy because he's not here. Yeah, but they can't do it if everybody's working from home because they won't know. So I'm not trying to hide things, but you know what? If people are working more from a remote location, it won't be as evident whether they're working 4 days or 3 days or 5 days or 4.5 because of that remoteness, because of that lack of visibility. So that's actually supportive of the idea of working fewer days because you can do it without having a negative impact from society. Okay, now what's going on in other countries? I guess two pieces of a response for you. If you look at where people are most satisfied with their jobs, and in a survey that's done every year by an international organization, where are people happiest? And wow, over the last decade or two that this has been going on, these surveys have been going on, it's really amazing. The people are happiest, the people are most satisfied with their jobs in Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Netherlands. So the first four of them are all Scandinavia, and the Netherlands is pretty close. It's unbelievable. These are all the countries, if you look at the number of hours worked per week, where the average number of hours worked per week is the absolute lowest in the entire world. It's, you know, like, where's the beef here? What am I missing? These guys are the happiest and they're working the fewest hours. And if you go like I did and correlate the number of hours worked with happiness across countries and also with motivation of people at work, I mean, the correlation is enormous, like 3/4 correlation. that the more hours you work, the less happy you are, or the other way around. The fewer hours you work, the happier you are. The fewer hours you work, the more productive you are as well on productivity. The fewer hours you work, the more motivated people say they are at work. Geez, I mean, this is really striking. And it's true across countries, but wow, that set of 5 countries is really, I don't know that I want to move, to Norway right away. And
Oh, the
freeze to
weather's
death.
the weather's not an advertisement for it. So that I know.
And even Holland, isn't that great relative to Arizona or Florida or California, Southern California or whatever. Just the United States, other than Alaska in general. So there's got to be something to be said for satisfaction, happiness being correlated with less hours at work. That's one part of my answer to you, and this is what we see in those other countries. The other, I better continue that. If you look at people who work even longer hours than in the United States, you find that it's a number of less developed countries, and I think Peru is one of them, since you mentioned Peru. But I mean Kazakhstan and a few other places as well, not to be demeaning of the specific countries, but there's a number of emerging markets where they work an average of 45 or 50 hours a week. And the people, at least in terms of self-presentation, say that they're less happy than the people in these other countries, including the US. So, I mean, it goes at both ends of the scale. People are happier when they work fewer hours, and they are less happy than in the US when they work more hours. Although admittedly, it's less developed countries that are the ones that are in that latter category. Okay, now, what are examples that we have? You mentioned one of them, which was Microsoft in Japan a couple of years ago, 2 years ago. They didn't call it an experiment, but they let people work 4-day weeks for a month, and they discovered, wow, their productivity was just as good as when they were working 5 days a week. So, there it is. The lesson's clear, except that what did they do as a result of that? Nothing. They went back to working 5-day weeks, and they didn't, internalize it on a continuing basis. So that's a little discouraging, but at least it's an example of a big company taking a shot at it. And I think that one can see, you haven't mentioned them, but you probably do in your discussion with other people that you work with, because there's entrepreneurial companies like that one in New Zealand, a Perpetual Guardian company, which I think is an insurance company. And they've been working 4-day weeks for 2 years or 3 years now, and everybody loves it, and they're sticking with it. And you've got the government of the city of Gottenham in Sweden set this program up of working 4-day weeks, and it worked very well. But people around the city were getting mad when they couldn't get service on the 5th day if the government offices just closed. No, I mean, that's real. And so you could split your employees to different days and still cover 5 days, but they didn't. And so that got a lot of flack, and they did not continue that program. And then there's other entrepreneurial companies in the US. I think Shake Shack has done that, the restaurant that sells milkshakes and hamburgers. And I don't know, there's 3 or 4 others. There's one in Philadelphia that I forget the name of right now. But they've done this, and as far as I know, none of them still continues to do it. They've done it for 6 months or a year or a couple of years, but they all seem to fall back on the original model. And I can't say that any of them has been a failure in the sense that in the surveys of people who work there and customers, nothing looks wrong. I mean, everything seems to be better with a 4-day week, but they still haven't continued it. So I can't speak to why. There's one example that's really great, but it isn't a company, and it's a school district. It's schools, elementary schools and high schools in several states, but particularly Colorado, which has been doing this since 1971. That's a ways back, everybody. This is not last week. So for 50 years, they have been doing a 4-day work week in school districts that choose to do this. And they have, I don't know, something on the order of 100 school districts around the state, and close to 70 of them are using the 4-day week. And what it means is, just to give this specific context to a school, the kids go off in the morning and they come back in the afternoon, and the parents have to get daycare or something for them between the 3 o'clock or 2:30 when they finish and 5 o'clock when the parents finish work, whatever it is. When you do the 5-day week, that's what it is. When you do the 4-day week, schools decided in Colorado anyway, to keep the school year 36 weeks. So the summer is the same length. But the school day now, instead of being 6 hours, is 7.5. So it's a longer school day. It's good for the parents because they don't have to deal with the issue of what do you do with my kids after school. So that's, that's positive. But, you may think, Professor Grosse is making it up to hide that it's really a bad deal. Well, the teachers say that they do like it. The kids haven't complained or done, well, I don't know if they complain or not, but they get fewer days in school, so they're happy about that. But I mean, their test scores on the standardized tests have been just as good. So there hasn't been a fall off in quote unquote productivity in that sense. And people in the communities in Colorado who've been interviewed, you can find this on the internet if you look on Colorado School 4-Day Week. And there's a couple different articles about it. And there's like a manual that talks about how they do it and experiences over the years. But wow, it's really working great. And it hasn't been experienced as long in those other 3 or 4 states that are doing the same thing. But the Colorado example is beautiful. And so there is one in the United States that is a real 4-day week, been going for 50 years. They're not, as far as I know, planning to stop this. And the customers are happy, the workers are happy, and the community hasn't been outraged at this unacceptable way of doing things.
Yeah, I think so much of this is about flexibility. So even then when people say, well, what happens if things go down? Okay, well then do every other week, do 9 out of 10 days, do 19 out of 20 days. There's so many different ways. It doesn't have to be so dogmatic. And to your point about, sometimes customers get upset. Well, that's one of those risks in any business, any change you make. And so some people might say, no, that's not okay. I think if people can see and experience it, then they change. For example, for my clientele who are primarily entrepreneurs, when they realize that I'm not reachable on Friday, that's actually more of a badge of honor than it is where the heck is Wade. Now, there's a small percent that don't like that, and those usually don't stay clients very long. I get to make that choice. What I simply see is, as with any other change, specifically going back to the employee, is if it's something that's really important, there are companies that are looking to do this. Basecamp is one of they used to be called 37 Signals.
Right.
That, they've done that. And again, they might be small amounts. Okay, great. Well but then go where those small amounts of companies are, because what I find more and more is a lot of companies are afraid to do it because they don't have the numbers to even know how productive are we. Whereas if they can measure it, and you and I hope we're going to have another conversation. Some of the best wisdom I got on this was from a friend of mine who's owned multiple businesses. And I asked him, I said, tell me something, Marty, if your employees could work, could get 5 days of results done in 4 days, would you give them 4 days? And he said, maybe. He says, but wait, I'm still taking all the risks. He says, what if they could get me 5.5 or 6 days worth of results? I said, okay, great. So again, it was still this, well, if it's only about the employee, well, no. I mean, in any agreement, why should it just be on the employer? But if the employer and the employee, so the oversimplified way, which isn't always easy to do, but I said, look, if you can get 6 days worth of results, I'll pay you to work for 4 days, because now I've gained and you've gained. And again, that's an oversimplification. It could be a different number, but something where we acknowledge that this is an adult relationship economically, that you want something, I want something, and maybe we can work something out. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I've got to go.
Shared. I'm going to just share with people, if you have not had a chance, check out whether it's the audiobook. I'm an audiobook guy, so I listen to your audiobook, or the book, The 4-Day Workweek. What's other than that, I happen to get that through Audible or on Amazon. For those people who want to learn more about what you're doing, where can they contact you, and what, if anything, are you working on next?
Well, anybody's welcome to contact me on my at my email, which is robert.gross at the easiest way at asu.edu, since Thunderbird is part of Arizona State University, but you can put thunderbird.asu.edu too. I don't run a separate I do have a website, but I don't pay much attention to it, so it's not worth doing other than through the university, where I have a web page. And I'm happy to communicate anytime on this subject, which is very dear to my heart, as it is to yours, Wade. And
absolutely. Thank you so much. And for those of you all, really, there's so much. And the other book, the one called 4-Day Weeks, that's how I refer to it, Across the Pond, is the one that involves Andrew Barnes from the Perpetual Garden. Actually, he's more than across the pond. He's across the planet, I guess. He's in New Zealand. But the thing that really struck me is there were so many things that both of you all researched some macro pieces, and I learned so much. So I encourage, there's so many people I talk like, well, it wouldn't work. Do the reading. I learned, so I've been doing this for 5 years, and I learned so much from listening to you, to what you're doing, because there were gaps I didn't have. I kind of had this sort of almost like, well, it seems to make sense, or I was kind of using more anecdotal knowledge. So I really encourage people, this is something that's important to you. If you work with millennials or know anybody that works with millennials, they want more time off. They've already seen this. Many of them have seen their parents not get the good end of the stick of what happened with, layoffs and all these different
Sure.
things. And so there's a different ethos, and not all of them are lazy. Many of them are looking for simply a better life, and they're not believing in that deferred lifestyle that at 65, I'm going to start to live.
Yeah.
And
Boy, that's
so
rough.
again, there's so much out there. Thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, I look forward to having another one of these. And for those of you listening, as always, look forward to helping you make more money and help more people in less time, do what you do best, so you can better enjoy your family, your friends, and your life. Thanks for listening.